My goal with this video is to answer every single question that you have about taking notes in college so that you can spend your time actually writing your notes and not just watching videos about note-taking like you are right now. My name is Clarissa. I am the CEO and founder of She Rocks at College, and I created the #1 program for college success, which is called Educated: The Art of Becoming a Good Student. So here are some questions that I'm going to be answering in this video. So I'm going to talk about what makes notes good. I'm going to talk about which note-taking method is best. I'm going to talk about where you should be taking your notes from. And one thing that I will not be talking about is things like whether you should handwrite or type your notes, different note-taking apps, because frankly, that stuff doesn't matter as much as you think it does as a student. And I really want you focusing your time and attention on the things that are going to help you to learn, retain, and retrieve the information that you're learning in class. So most students judge whether or not their notes are good by either how much they write or how little they write, how their notes look, whether they're neat and organized, or how long it actually takes them to write notes. So you will create stories about whether or not you're a good note taker based off of how your notes look, how much information's in them, and then how long it took you to write it. And none of that actually determines whether or not your notes are good or bad. So I'm first going to address what the point of taking notes is, okay? So the first thing that you have to understand is that learning happens in your brain and with the use of your brain. It's the thinking about the concepts that you're being taught in your class that creates the learning, that creates the retention, and that creates the ability for you to retrieve the information when you need it, i.e., a paper, an exam, or a presentation. So the point of note-taking is really to use it as a tool to slow you down enough so that you can think about the concepts that you're being taught in your class, whether that's through a textbook, whether that's through a lecture in a PowerPoint, whether that's through a pre-recorded lecture, right? So the reason why we're taking notes is so that we can slow ourselves down so that we can think about the content and the concepts that we're being taught in this class. And when I say so that you can think about the content, so you can think about the concepts, what I mean is stopping and asking yourself questions about what you just learned. Asking yourself questions like, what makes sense about this? What doesn't make sense? What do I get? What don't I get? What does this remind me of? Can I connect this or relate this to anything else? Starting to get curious about the information is the process of thinking. And it's that process of thinking that creates the neural pathways in your brain that helps you to learn the information, retain it, and then be able to retrieve it later when you're being asked questions about it. So with that in mind, when we're talking about note-taking, what your notes should contain is it really should reflect your understanding of those concepts and those topics. It should be a physical representation of all of the thinking that you did in your brain. That's really what should be going down in your notes. And so when you look back at your notes, you should be able to recall the thinking that led to that information being written down. So we're not taking notes just to say that we took notes anymore, right? We're not taking notes because we think that that is what we should be doing to study. We're going to start taking notes because we understand that note-taking is a tool to help us slow down and think about the content, because it's the thinking about the content that leads to us learning it, understanding it, retaining it, and then being able to retrieve it later to write a paper on the topic, or to answer some test questions on the topic, or to give a presentation on the topic, okay? So now that we understand what our notes should contain, the purpose of note taking, which is it's just a tool to slow you down so that you can think about the content, because it's the thinking about the content that creates the learning, retention, and ability to retrieve. I'm saying this over and over so that it really stands out in this video, okay? So what I want to talk about now is the difference between note-taking structure and note-taking strategy, okay? So note-taking structure is how your notes look. So this is whether or not you organize your thinking in a mind map, whether or not you organize your thinking in an outline format, whether or not you organize your thinking in a Cornell type of method, whether or not you organize your thinking on flashcards, right? So when I talk about structure, it's how your notes look. When I talk about note-taking strategy, this is the why behind why you're taking your notes the way that you are in the first place, right? So when we talk about what the best note-taking method is all of the note-taking methods work. So mind maps are great, outline format, great, taking notes directly on the PowerPoint, great, using flashcards to take your notes, great, the Cornell method of note-taking, great. All of those structures don't matter, because what you really need to be thinking about, how you need to choose which method is best for whatever class it is that you're taking, is which method do I feel like I need in this moment to help me to organize my thinking around this concept? Which note-taking structure is going to help me to organize the making sense of this content for my brain? So again, you're using the note-taking structure as a tool to help you slow down and think about the content. And organizing the content, right? Trying to make connections with it, trying to like figure out what comes first, what goes next, trying to figure out how to actually structure it in your physical notes. All of that is you thinking about the content. So the effort that you put behind it, right? The thinking that you put behind how you're organizing the information in your mind map, how you're organizing the information in your outline will actually help you to learn it and retain it, because it's forcing you to think about how does this make the most sense, which is what thinking is, okay? So basically what I just did is just answered the question about like what note-taking method is best. And it's whatever note-taking method in the moment you feel is best to help you to organize and think about the content for that particular class. So what this means is that your note-taking style might change class to class, semester to semester, depending on what is needed to help you to think and make sense about the content and the concepts that you're learning in that particular class. So then this brings me to the next question that I get a lot from students, which is, where do I take my notes from? Because the professor is telling me to, focus on the textbook, and then other students are telling me to focus on the PowerPoint, and then there's also the lecture. I'm just not sure where I should be focusing my time and attention. And the way that I help my students make this decision inside of my program, Educated the Art of Becoming a Good Student, is generally whatever is being discussed in class. If you have an assigned textbook for this class or assigned readings, whatever is being discussed in class is based off of the topics in those textbooks or the assigned readings. And the PowerPoint is just the professor's notes on that content, right? It's just their little format that they're using to remind themselves of what they want to talk about in class. So with that being said, whatever he or she is saying, whatever your professor is saying, is probably going to be in the PowerPoint, and that information is probably going to be in the textbook. And if you focus on really understanding what the point of the class is, what you're supposed to get out of it, and if you're someone that doesn't know how to do that, I have a video that I will link either in the description box or up at the top of this video on how I determine what's important. And this is a process that I teach my students as well, because if you understand what's important, it really won't matter where you decide to take your notes from. It's just going to be personal preference, right? And so I tell my students, typically, if you're saying it in class, it's on the PowerPoint or it's in the textbook, right? It's like all the information is there. You just need to choose whichever preferred way you like to receive and think about information. Now, the exception is if your professor specifically says, I will only be testing you on textbook content, or I will only be testing you on the articles, or I will only be testing you on the lecture, or if they say, I expect you to come to lecture because I'm going to be giving you things that are not going to be in the textbook. So if you get that information given to you either from your professor's mouth or you read about it in the syllabus, then you know that you need to be sort of comparing and contrasting the two to make sure that the information lines up. But generally, the information is the same across the board on lecture, PowerPoint, and textbook. And then it just becomes your decision on where you prefer to go deep with your thinking on that information, okay? So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is how to develop the skill of note taking. So how do you get really good at creating a physical representation of the thinking that you've done in your brain about the content and the concepts? So this is the structure that I normally give my students who I work with personally as an academic life coach. So the first thing is I want you to focus primarily on the point of taking notes. Point of taking notes is that it is a physical representation of all of the thinking that you did in your brain about the content and the concepts. So what becomes really important here is that you truly have a good grasp on what you're supposed to have learned at the end of your semester. And this information can be easily found in your syllabus. It can be easily found in the PowerPoint objectives or course outcomes. It's there if you look for it. It's there if you know how to use it, right? So I tell my students, this is what we're going to focus on, okay? Now that we understand what the point of the class is, we actually use those learning objectives, learning outcomes, wherever it is that you find them in your particular course to help us to think about the content and the concepts in the class. And then that becomes the physical representation of the thinking we did in our brain in our actual notes. And I tell my students, I want you to just take your best educated guess on which structure you think is going to help you to organize the thinking that you did in your brain. So Cornell, mind map, flashcards, outline, which way it is that you want to do it. I also want you to pick whether you're going to handwrite or you're going to type, okay? And you're going to stick to that structure for at least up until the first exam. You're not going to change it, okay? You're going to take all of your notes for this particular class in that way until your first exam. And then after you take your first exam, you're going to do a post-exam review, which is something that I teach to my students inside of my program, Educated the Art of Becoming a Good Student. And you're going to evaluate what is working, what's not working, and what you're going to change and focus on for the next exam with your note-taking based off of what worked and what didn't work. And I go into detail on this process inside of my program. How you know that your notes are good is if it helped you to learn, retain, and be able to retrieve the information on an exam or when you're writing a paper or when you're doing a presentation. And the only reason why the notes were good was because you took the time to think about the content and the concepts. Now, if you want to learn how I teach my students to get into the habit of writing more effective notes that are a physical representation of the thinking that they did, and you want to learn how to start thinking about the content and the concepts in your class so that you can learn it, understand it, retain it, and then be able to retrieve it when it matters, I'm going to put a link to a video on the note-taking method that I teach my students. Now, it is similar to the Cornell method of note-taking, not the structure, but the idea of asking yourself questions, because the act of asking yourself questions is the act of thinking. And remember how I've said over and over in this video, thinking is what actually helps you to learn, understand, retain, and retrieve it when you need it. And so I teach a very particular method in my course, and when I work with students one-on-one, not because I think that this is the best note-taking structure, but because asking yourself these questions and forcing yourself to answer it and to think about it is what's going to help you to understand the information. And again, I will either have a link to that video in the description box or you'll see it somewhere on this screen. So I called this video the ultimate guide to taking notes as a college student, because I want this to be the last video that you ever watch about note-taking. I don't want you to have any more confusion or drama about note-taking, because I just explained to you in this video what actually matters. Everything else, the color coding, the different structures of the notes, you get to have fun with that. You get to choose whatever your preferred style is, as long as you understand that all notes is a physical representation of all the thinking that you did in your brain about the content and the concepts that you're being taught in this class. And if you just learn how to get really good at thinking about the content and the concepts in your class, the notes don't really matter, because it really is just a tool. There are students who earn A's and B's and never, ever take notes, because they're learning by just using your brain, because that's where learning happens. Now, if you loved this video and you're thinking to yourself right now, my goodness, where has this woman been my entire life that I've been in college, and I would love to work with you, I have a program called Educated: The Art of Becoming a Good Student, where I teach students a very simple process of succeeding in college, because all it comes down to is having an effective study plan, having a weekly schedule where that study plan fits into, and then getting yourself to stick to it all semester long so that you can earn better grades and have more free time. And you can find out more information about that program in the description box.